But it can't be easy.
It's not that hard, but it's not that easy either. All right. So we are live now.
Are we streaming?
We are streaming on YouTube.
Well, Rabbi Andy, thank you for streaming me on YouTube.
Yes, you're welcome. Um, I
Are you
need
gonna open the
to, um, and so I'm still working on getting this set up. All of you on YouTube, thank you for being here on time. We've got a bunch of people that are on Zoom as well, but I want to make sure they can't unmute. And now I'm going to let them in. Welcome, folks who are here on Zoom. Um, I've got it so you can't unmute yet, but we will have time later for you to ask questions and unmute. We are also streaming live on YouTube, so anything you say or ask will also be going out on YouTube. Um, and I need to just change one more setting, and then we're good to go. Um, awesome. All right. Dr. Marjorie Feld, thank you so much for your time this evening, for being with us, for the incredible work you've done to, um, unearth this history of American Jewish life that has been, you know, hidden. And right now, perhaps like you couldn't have even imagined the way in which this book would have been resonant when it was published. Because obviously you started writing it. When did you start writing it?
Been 8 years. It took me
Oh, wow.
7.5, 8 years to write it.
Yeah. So, and then it came out what, in
Last May,
February of 2024? May.
May of
May
2020.
of 2024. So tell me about that whole journey. What was that? What were those 8 years like? What was it like to all of a sudden be almost ready to publish? Then, October 7th occurs, and so much happened in those 8 years as well.
Yes. Well, so my journey began really with a senior thesis, right? I think a lot of us in academia, we have a first book that was a project of our young adult years rather, and mine was a biography of Lillian Wald. And what's important for this unfolding narrative is that Wald, who was a social worker, many of you might know her as the founder of Henry Street Settlement House, which is still thriving on New York's Lower East Side. She was a public health nurse, social worker, one of the architects of the New Deal social welfare legislation. Anyway, I discovered in my research that she was an anti-Zionist, really. I guess we would use
Hmm,
that word. She died in 1940, but she really stood outside of the American Jewish growing support for a political state, a political Jewish state. So she had been claimed by a lot of sisterhoods and places like that, synagogue settings, right? So when I went to deliver talks about her, if I happened to mention it, I could feel the frostiness of that
sure.
reception. And, I was curious about it. And also, it resonated pretty deeply with me as somebody who had grown up in a very supportive, pro-Israel household. So um, by the time it was, I got tenure and then I was writing my second book, I was thinking about a lot of Jews I knew. And this is something, Rabbi Andy, you and I have talked about quite a lot. This was the early 2000s, and I was surrounded by a lot of Jews who had really left the American Jewish sort of affiliated world or institutional world in the 80s, right? When they were coming of age as young adults. These were people a little bit older than me. Many of them were active in the anti-apartheid movement, or maybe, fought Reagan's policies in Latin America. And in the 80s, there was just this really low threshold of dissent, if I want to quote my own book. There was very little available to American Jews in institutional Jewish life about Palestinian history. It was just sort of an adamant, unqualified Zionism. So a lot of these Jewish academics, activists whom I knew, stood outside the American Jewish world. And so I decided to write a book about the anti-apartheid movement, the anti-South Africa apartheid movement. And right when I was sitting down to write, I mean, like literally in the library, I looked up and there was an article by Naomi Klein
Uh,
about the early 2000s conferences in Durban, South Africa, on anti-colonialism and reparations. And Israel, the US, and Canada all refused to go because they felt there would be loud critics of Israel, among other reasons. I mean, there were also some pretty virulent deniers of Holocaust history and things like that there. But her position was that, like my observation, it kind of resonated with my observations. Her position was that if American Jews don't allow the United States or stand as obstacles to the United States engaging with discussions about colonialism, that this was going to put them in opposition to progressive forces. And that,
yeah.
in fact, it had continued to put them in opposition to progressive forces with regard to civil rights. So that was the second book, which was really about American Jews in the anti-apartheid movement. When I finished the book, again, it was going to press. Mandela died. Um, and there were just this unbelievable number of op-eds that were appearing on the web. It's kind of an early time in the web, but was Mandela good for the Jews? And I was studying the anti-apartheid movement. You and I have talked about this, and it was just this breathtaking qualification to American Jewish grief over his death. This global leader of the movement who had fought for the liberation of so many different kinds of people. So that ended up being kind of the capstone to that project. And so my interest in American Jews and how their positions, and of course, sorry, I guess I should have said, but perhaps it's implied that Mandela had likened the struggle against apartheid in South Africa with Palestinian struggle against Israeli forces. So
There's there's also this fascinating story. You probably know it, that I learned a couple of years ago. There's an organization in New York called Jews for Racial and Economic Justice.
of course,
Yes, yes. Well, I know you know that JFREG exists,
yeah.
but the history of how it was founded was that Mandela was coming to New York on his speaking tour, and the entirety of the Jewish establishment was refusing to welcome him because he had just publicly met with Arafat. And JFREG, which is now an incredibly important like figure in the Jewish institutional network, particularly in New York, but also nationally, um, like really got its start by there being a handful of rabbis and other Jewish leaders in New York who were dissenting. And we're like, no, we cannot let this stand. There needs to be some kind of delegation of Jewish leadership to welcome Nelson Mandela, and that's what they did. And so, yeah, it's very, it's a snapshot of that exact issue.
It is indeed. And that story I tell in my book too,
Oh,
in my
great. Yeah.
second book. Yeah, and Elisa Solomon was so kind and sent me all this archival material. She was one of the founders of JFREG. Um, and talk about like a loop, right? I was just at a Jews and the Left conference and I met some of the people, Audrey, how do you say her last name?
Sassoon.
Sasson.
Yeah.
And she and I connected over what's happening now with JFREG and what happened with Mandela and the founding of JFREG. So I guess what compelled me to write this book, and this is perhaps a long-winded way of saying it, but what compelled me to write this book was my contention, my observation, which was up until then just anecdotal, that the unqualified American Jewish support for Israel that I grew up with, that many of us grew up with, that was really ascendant in American Jewish life, especially and sort of in a locked in way in the 1980s, that this prevented American Jews from, or had the potential to prevent some American Jews from engaging in progressive coalitions for
Yeah.
change. So if they felt that Israel was assailed in the lefty feminist movement, then they felt it was not even a choice to join because they thought that was inherently anti-Jewish. If there were in the anti-apartheid movement, there were critiques of Israel because the Black community, Arab Muslim communities had such rich critiques of colonialism, including Israel, across the 20th century. American Jews who tried to join these movements felt that by criticizing Israel, they were taking anti-Jewish stands. And so they felt that it was a choice they had to make, or
Mhm.
that was ultimately made for them, to exit these movements. So I sat down to write this book 8 years ago. And, I myself have taken positions on my own lack of support for Israel for the last, I guess it's been about 9 or 10 years publicly. I was really interested in seeking self-identified American Jews who dissented from this, alleged consensus on American Zionism in Israel. And so I went looking for them, and that resulted in this book. You asked about publishing it. I mean, I can talk about that. It was really, it went to press. It went to press twice. It went to press after the elections with the far right coalition in what was that, 20? So that was the November before October 7th, right? It was the year before. And there was a kind of an opening. A lot of American Jews, including many Zionists I knew, were open to my book and happy that my book was coming out, and thought that Netanyahu's coalition, it's anti-feminism, it's anti-Arab racism, it's homophobia and anti-trans rights positions, that these were all major disqualifiers, that an American Jewish world would not be open to a Netanyahu coalition. And then October 7th happened, and the book
Yeah.
was really just on the cusp of being printed. And my editor asked me to write a coda, what it is like now for you, Marjorie, writing this book, publishing this book. And the word I just kept using was bereft, because the doors that had been open, even among some of my liberal Zionist friends, closed
Yeah.
rapidly and pretty violently as support fell behind Israel.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think probably I know I experienced that too. I think a lot of people kind of working in that way of trying to both be openly critical and maintain relationships with people who were less so. I definitely had that experience across the board after October 7th. Um, and for me, reading your book after that was such a machaya, such like a feeling of healing to not only find all of these kind of fellow travelers throughout history, but also your voice in it. I don't know. I don't want to get like saccharine, but like made me feel less alone. Like you obviously saw this thing that I had seen as well, and were able to um, articulate it and articulate the historical narrative in such a compelling and accessible way that it was wonderful. Um,
Well,
and
thank
at
you.
the Yeah, thank you. And at the same time, I had uh, just started the journey of getting involved with the ACJ. And so much of your book is about the ACJ and Rabbi Elmer Berger and Rabbi Morris Lazarone. And in the last interview that I did with Matt Berkman, I talked about both of them a little bit. But I didn't talk much about um, their kind of journey into like truly pro-Palestinian activism in the 1950s, which for rabbis, that's like it's wild that they were doing that, and that they had such foresight to see where this all was heading. Can you talk a little bit about how they may have gotten there and what they saw and what they did, like especially in those early years?
Sure. I think that, I mean, Matt's presentation, Dr. Berkman's presentation was marvelous, and your interview was marvelous. I really learned a lot. I always learn when I talk to you and to him. And of course, their geopolitical positioning is really essential. It's really I mean, it's the backdrop, it's the foundation on which the council began.
Mhm.
Um, and I guess I'll start by saying two things. I really emphasize how everyone in the book is self-identified as Jewish, but it became really important to me, and perhaps even of heightened importance after October 7th, but to indicate the degree to which everybody in the book really cares about Jewish communal life,
Yeah.
because they do. And one of the things that, every book has when you're in the archives, you have your moments. And I was at I was at Yeshiva University looking at some papers of Berger's, Rabbi Berger's, that hadn't been looked at that much. And he was in conversation with some, I believe it's called the VOD, right? The Orthodox
Oh,
Union. And it was in the 40s, and he was touring displaced person camps. And he is expressing his really urgent concern for displaced people, Holocaust refugees. He is really active trying to liberalize American immigration law. So I just, even in the 1940s and 50s, it becomes really important, I think, then and throughout the book, to indicate the degree to which these people all care deeply about Jewish safety, Jewish lives, Jewish communal life. So,
yeah, and I I'm grateful that you said that because even now, right, when I talk to some people or like, people say stuff online um about the history of the ACJ, there is this canard out there, this like awful slander of these leaders that they didn't care about the displaced people from the Holocaust, that they didn't care about the issues of immigration, that they cared more about like combating Jewish nationalism than they did about these individuals. And it's just not true.
no,
They
it's not.
devoted so much time and energy to trying to help the people who were displaced be able to go where they wanted to go.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And also the conditions in the camps were also
Yeah.
of concern to him. So it's just one of those things that it became a quest for me, and it was important to me. So when I talk about the council, and when I've talked about it to the places I've been talking about this book, I use this phrase, "they are enduring questions." The enduring questions raised by the council in the 50s and the 60s were really important. And I think they help, at least in part, I hope, to explain what you asked, which is how some of the rabbis involved in the council make this journey into Palestinian rights. Because certainly all of their, or most of their framing is about the Cold War and Jewish safety and what we would think of as whiteness, right? And social
Mhm.
mobility. Ultimately, what they want to do is keep their family safe from accusations of dual loyalties, which are very, painful and real, and, inherently connected to anti-Semitism. But some of the questions that they raise that I bring up in slides when I give these presentations are, well, one of them is who gets to speak on behalf of American Jews, right? So as they're starting to diverge from the Zionist, what becomes the Zionist mainstream, and the brand of American Zionism, as we know, that was emerging was an unquestioning loyalty to Israel, right? It wasn't
Right.
just fealty to the state of Israel with room for question. It was an unquestioning loyalty to Israel. So who gets to speak for American Jews? Why do all of these leaders increasingly speak in ways that are just, that they present themselves as all-encompassing leaders, that they represent everyone, when we are part of American Jewry too? Even scholars talk about affiliate American Jews or American Jewish organizations in the 40s and 50s and completely ignore the council, which is not, accurate. So there were organized American Jews organized around the principles of anti-nationalism or anti-Zionism, who were asking these questions about why is it only the Zionist leaders who get the mic, right? Why? And so they had these into the 50s and even the early 60s, they had these questionnaires that they distributed that I assume Berger and his folks wrote, that they sent it out to all these all of their members, and it asked that when a newspaper or a radio show records the voice or elicits commentary from Zionist leaders, that they accompany it with somebody from the council. So they're asking for balance in American Jewish life as representation of American Jewish leaders and lay people alike. So there's that question of who speaks on behalf of American Jews, the representativeness of American Jewish leaders. And I think you talked about this last week, Rabbi Andy, about religious schools and
Mhm.
how sustainable, they didn't use that word, but how sustainable is it for American Jewish religious schools, synagogue Hebrew schools, what we would have called, what I called mine, how sustainable is it to only focus on Israel, right? Why are we not teaching other ethical monotheism or prophetic Judaism or Torah for that matter? Why are we not teaching these things, right? And then another thing I'll say, just before we talk about Palestinians or what they would have called Arab refugees, is about money, right? A
Yeah.
lot of the council were just articulating these critiques that we would hear today as so relevant. Why is all the money going to programming around Israel and Zionism? We're gonna starve domestic American Jewish life. We need this money not to flow abroad, but to stay here and build infrastructure. So, and infrastructure not necessarily around loyalty to Israel and Zionism.
Right.
So those are some of those, what I can call those enduring questions. And then too, you have people like Rabbi Lazaron and Berger who start with some of these questions and then start, I think somehow locating themselves outside of that Zionist consensus or the overwhelmingly and increasingly Zionist leadership leads them to questions about the native population of Palestine, what becomes Israel. And so then they make these really amazing journeys that, Dr. Jeff Levin records in his book, The Question of Palestine, into representing Palestinian rights as some of the only individuals. Is something the council is quite notable for, and I think should be proud of, if I can say, for being some of the only voices of support for Palestinian rights in the 50s and 60s. And, Berger, as you and I have talked about, was not an easy personality to be around from all the records that I've read. But he also alienated himself from the American Jewish world. And I think it's the Guardian in the UK that calls him the rabbi with more friends in Islam by the early 1970s, because American Jews have really, marginalized him and rejected his perspective that we now look back on and consider many of the things that he said prescient, right, with
Yeah.
regard to the native population in Palestine and Israel.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's funny that we started talking about him with his work for Jewish refugees, and then it seems very clear, especially based on the language that he used around the universal ethics of Judaism, right? Was the common phrase that some would call what he talked about Jewish universalism, that to him, those two refugee populations were equally in need of support. And certainly he cared about the Jewish one because it was Jewish, but also he would have, and those who kind of were rooted in the ethics of that mode of Reform Judaism prior to it becoming Zionized, um, knew that the universals of these ethics had to apply to everyone. And so it's one of the things that is inspiring to me about both of these rabbis is that they put their money where their mouth was, right? They actually did this stuff.
They did. And I mean, I think, well, I'm sure obviously you know this, but there was such a high cost. I mean,
Yes,
they could have easily not done it or turned away from it or done it privately in a way, but I think Lazaron he becomes emeritus, right, in the late 40s, and then I think loses his emeritus status for a while because the folks at his synagogue in, I think it's Baltimore,
Baltimore, yeah.
yeah, they become so disenchanted with him. Ultimately, I believe it was reinstated, but there's such a cost to speaking out the way they do that
Mhm.
and there's also all this interconnections, right? Because later in the book I talk about another he's a journalist, not a rabbi, William Zuckerman, and they all knew each other. And so there's kind of this mutually supporting group of people who are looking at and these are people who, I mean, Zuckerman was watching the Holocaust unfold until 41. That's when he left London as a correspondent. He was there as a correspondent. And so he had an awareness, right? So again, there's this defiance of this idea that these are people who didn't care or know about the Holocaust and they didn't. This is somebody who cared deeply, who had watched this destruction up close, and then connects with Berger and Lazaron and others who are critical of the Zionist project, the building up of Israel as a state and as a Jewish state, and what we would call now ethnocracy. And their criticism resonates with us still. So I think those enduring questions, like this is why they're enduring questions, right? Because they
Right.
were raised, they put them on this brave journey to represent Palestinian interests. And to say, and this is what you're saying, right, Andy, that it's intertwined with Jewish interests. Like if the whole idea is to make a place that's going to keep Jews safe, the way they're going about it, a lot of these critics contend, the way they're building up this state is actually diminishing safety in
Yeah.
the region for Jews across the world. That's what a lot of them contend. And so that's, I think, really important.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that that has been borne out as well. Um, in your kind of getting to know these guys through their archives and reading what they wrote and maybe what others wrote about them, do you see anything in their personalities? Like, what is it about these people that led them to do that, right? Like, there must be some quirk. I don't know that you're able to see that through like research, but I just wonder if you picked anything up like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because, and you and I have talked about this as well. I think the last time I was in New York, we were talking about our own personal journeys. And so I'm just going to talk about myself for a second and use it
Please.
as an intro. But I grew up in in the 70s and 80s in what was called non-egal conservative synagogue, right? I was in a class with boys and I was not allowed to do a parsha. I was not allowed to do Haftorah. I couldn't do the Kiddush. Oh, sorry, I could do Haftorah. I couldn't lay in Torah. But and I felt that deep envy. And I also thought I was smarter than some of the guys in my class. So anyway,
You
I'm glad
certainly
that
were.
didn't spark laughter. But I just really wanted to do it and I wasn't allowed. And so when I was asked, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago to write about my journey away from Zionism, I said, well, I already kind of felt like an outsider. And I think that that probably lent itself, along with being surrounded by people who were, really challenging me. You're a feminist, you're an anti-racist. Why, how is it you still maintain this loyalty to Israel? So that forced me on this journey. And so I guess the question then for me is, did Berger and Zuckerman and some of these other folks feel like outliers in some ways that then took them on their journey? And I think that probably the council members, um, as Reformed Jews, they were pretty radical in their own time for some of the reforms that they were proposing. And that might have lent itself in a certain way. I've told you, I mean, there were moments in the archive with, when I say with,
Yeah.
reading Berger's documents, he wasn't actually there. But when I just thought, yeah, he was described as irascible. Um, yeah, and other things that I would say, maybe not on YouTube, but I don't, I just think he probably didn't treat women all that well based on
Yeah.
his the language that he uses in some of his writings. But so maybe there's a degree of a rebel in him where he
Mhm.
feels like he can take this position. But to attribute it as, I guess what scholars have done, scholars, anyone out to dismiss Lazarone, Berger, other critics of American Zionism, they often pathologize these
Yeah.
folks and say that they're self-hating or that they were megalomaniacs or that they were, but I think that's a way to discredit their critiques that is handy and inaccurate.
Yeah.
Um, because I think that they probably, I guess I would just go back to the idea that they somehow already felt a little bit like outsiders and then were open and smart and insightful and cared
Yeah.
enough to recognize what was going on and what was unfolding. I'm sure other people have more interesting and compelling interpretations. I'd
No,
be
I mean, I think
interested in
that's
hearing
right.
those.
That's, yeah. Um, so another figure beyond the ACJ that is similar, I mean, we see this happening right now. Marty Blatt, in many ways, was a precursor to a lot of what we see, and like you personally have very bravely continued saying what you believe, um, in the face of all kinds of terrifying stuff, right? There are many academics who don't, right? There are many academics who are shrinking away, and aren't necessarily standing with their students or aren't necessarily even standing by what they believe, and many who are. And Marty Blatt was this guy at Tufts that did this very early on, right? Um, can you share some about like how he got there, what he did, how it maybe is a precursor to what we're seeing now?
Sure. So, yeah, this is like right before COVID, like February 2020. I was in the archives downtown Boston looking in the ADL files, the Anti-Defamation League files, handwritten on a folder with something like Arab propaganda, anti-Semitism. I forget what the other labels are, but I opened the folder and there's all this material on this man named Marty Blatt. And he had a course at Tufts in 1973 called Zionism Reconsidered. And it was just one of those, moments of serendipity where I go home and I Google him and I find that he is indeed still in Cambridge, still an activist, in his early, well, I shouldn't say his age. Anyway, he's just still active in the American Jewish world. And I was able to interview him right before COVID shut everything down. But I guess I should back up a little bit. So Marty Blatt is a part of this chapter called Israel, Right or Wrong. And that's actually a quote from a woman who joins sort of his defense. There are not a lot of women, as you and I have talked about, Rabbi Andy, right? There are not a lot of women whose voices are recorded, which is a clear indication of the exclusion of women from American Jewish life, at least the visible and archival kind that we can find. So he was really active in the anti-war movement. And one of the things that I try to draw parallels between, which obviously is suggested by the chapter title, Israel, Right or Wrong, is this idea that there are a lot of young American Jews going to college in the 60s and 70s who become part of the anti-war movement. And the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, other anti-colonialist movements have, as I said, this rich and strong critique in Black America dating back to the 1930s and 40s of colonialism, and are beginning to craft critiques of Israel and seeing it as a colonialist movement. Israel is siding with France in the war in Algeria. Israel is building an alliance with apartheid South Africa. And all of these things are lending itself and feeding this strong critique of Israel as a colonizing power. So it takes, and I review this in the chapter, I don't need to go into it here, but it takes a couple sort of anti-communist young intellectuals in the American Jewish world to sort of make room for this idea that you can oppose Vietnam, but still give your unqualified support to Israel. And that becomes, there are several presidents, Nixon, Reagan, others, who use, who basically bludgeon the American Jewish community by saying, you dissent from my policies and I'll support Israel less. And because there appears to be this consensus on Israel, that ends up being a very effective tool to use with American Jews. But Marty Blatt starts in the anti-war movement, but yet, despite this, gradual shift in the anti-war movement or among Jews in the anti-war movement to be critical of Vietnam, but still loyal to Israel, he falls in with some members of the Israeli left who are visiting the Boston area. And he starts understanding the connections between what's going on in Vietnam and what's going on in Israel. And he wrote a book, co-wrote a book on draft dissenters, draft resistors in Israel when he was just out of undergrad. And those same years find him wanting to teach a class on, critics, Jewish and otherwise, of Israel. So he teaches his class at Tufts in what's called the Experimental College, which still exists, in 1970. Marty Blatt grew up in Brooklyn and was in a liberal Zionist household. He had one grandfather who perished in a Nazi camp, and his parents were, liberals. I believe they worked in the Kennedy campaign, or maybe he worked in the Kennedy campaign. So he comes to Tufts, he joins the anti-war movement, he falls in with members of the Israeli left, he learns from them, and he decides to offer this class. The class, and this is really important, right, by all accounts, was a really balanced class. He taught about the history of Zionism, he taught about the history of anti-Zionism, but somehow the Jewish Defense League, who many of you probably know, a right-wing, anti-Arab racist group, they find out about the class and they march into his classroom uninvited and they spit on Marty Blatt and they put out these pamphlets, these flyers that say, "Not since Germany in the days of Hitler has any university dared to offer a course presenting a one-sided view of any national movement." Now, there were, importantly, Zionists and anti- and non-Zionists in the class, all of whom thought it was a very balanced class, but The JDL attacks the course. It draws attention. And I mean, this is all in this file that I'm leafing through in Boston. All the Boston Federation leaders get together, they meet about the class, they go in and there are probably, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 letters in the Tufts archives by concerned Jewish Bostonians. Everybody's worried. And when the language is just over the top, that his course represents anti-Jewish, it's an anti-Jewish outrage that's echoed throughout these letters. It's the destruction of Jewish people. It's going to lead people to anti-Semitism. He is in his house one day, he gets a call and somebody on the phone says they shouldn't have saved your grandparents. So there's this tie between his own Holocaust history and his openness to his willingness to engage in discussions, critical discussions about Israel that is, then sort of cemented by that call. So he to their credit, the Tufts Experimental College continues to run the class, but they have to continue, they met over and over with critics of the course. They had to assuage Jewish leaders in Boston, and also these Jewish leaders put their money together and proposed another course about Zionism that ran alongside Marty's class the second time. So I think any of this, Andy, could have pushed anyone away from Jewish affiliation and institutional life. But to his credit, he is still active in the Jewish world. But the forces that fell on him and attacked him, it's kind of hard to overstate what happened, the harassment for years.
Yeah.
And so we were talking about Tufts, right? Because it was 2 weeks ago in a few days when a student was removed, captured by ICE and taken away for what we assume is because she co-authored an article in the Tufts newspaper critical of Israel and Gaza.
Yeah.
But this, you were asking me, or we were thinking that this Marty's class was probably the first example of a course that taught the history of dissent, but we don't even know if it was the first class, right? But the implications of this class rippled outward for years and years, and were an example of how critics of the unqualified support for Israel were really marginalized and punished over and over again.
Yeah. And it continues to happen, right? We all know this. But people don't stop trying. And you haven't stopped trying. Um, and we found out as we were chatting and talking about this event right now that both of us were holding Shabbat services um, on the same day, yours in Boston, mine in Brooklyn, for these communities of people that have felt chased out of Jewish life for um, their unwillingness to go along with the Israel right or wrong line, for their discomfort with the ways in which they had to swallow kind of their own lack of feeling of belonging when they're in a space that is consistently messaging support for Israel no matter what. So can you talk about yours a little bit? Because yours was different than mine. Mine was with the ACJ. It was our first Shabbat service um, in this new kind of arrangement. It was lovely, but yours was way more interesting than mine, in fact.
Well, that's in the eye of the beholder. I
Yes.
would really like to hear about yours too. So maybe I could talk first and then
You
you
talk
could.
first and then I'll talk. Sure.
Okay. So it was just, I don't know if I sent you the flyer. I can't remember how we happened to know that we were both on doing this last Shabbat, but so like a lot of synagogues, or maybe not a lot, but like some progressive or liberal synagogues, we have an affinity group of people who are non-anti-Zionists. And I know those are freighted words, but these are people who are critical of Israel and Zionism. And we were thinking about what we could do as a first event to come together and to show the congregation that we exist. And we decided on a Shabbat for Gaza. It was actually not my idea. The idea belonged to someone else. But so there's a member of our congregation, Sue Lancer, who's connected to many Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim activists in the area. She invited them. So we had readings of the Quran. We had Palestinian poetry. We had 70 people participating in our Kabbalat Shabbat. It was a beautiful ceremony. Our rabbi was there. Rabbi Toba Spitzer was present and showed her support. She introduced everyone to the shul. The synagogue, I offered an introduction where I talked about a podcast that you were on, Rabbi Andy, with Rabbi Alyssa Wise.
Mhm.
And on this podcast, she talked about how openness to different perspectives really nourishes American Jewish life. And we really need that nourishment right now. So I guess what I would say is the service was overwhelmingly successful. We were fearful that there would be controversy even within the congregation. We didn't know what to expect. People wouldn't leave.
Mhm.
There was a general, I mean, the mourner's Kaddish, which is a prayer you say for the dead. Several members of our congregation, I'll just tell this story and then I'll stop, but several members of the congregation had stood up at different times. In my shul, people stand up and say for whom they're grieving, and for whom they're saying Kaddish, and they had said names of people in Gaza and felt very frosty receptions, didn't feel altogether comfortable. And so at our Kaddish, last Kabbalat Shabbat, at our mourner's Kaddish, we recited names of children under the age of 18. Each name represented hundreds of others who had been murdered in Gaza. And this was it was comfortable. We were all able to grieve. It was also obviously terribly sad. But the idea that we could marry Judaism, Jewish ritual, to coalition building with the folks who were there from other communities, to our grief, to our dissent, was really important to a lot of us. And they were all ages, and really all levels of critique. There were J Street folks there. There were, adamant anti-Zionists there. All kinds of people were there.
Yeah, it's great. Um, and the way you just phrased that, being able to marry your Judaism with solidarity in that way. This is just a little plug for folks that are watching. Next month, I'm going to be interviewing Professor Italia Omer from Notre Dame, who wrote a whole book on this about
Did
how
indeed. A great
the
book.
it is a fantastic book called Days of Awe about how contemporary Jewish protest movements in solidarity with Palestine are building out a new form of Jewish identity around solidarity with Palestinians, which is it's an amazing book, and she's an amazing person. So next month, it'll be us. Um, but that there's there's also a kind of layer of critique that I have to that. Not that I think it's bad, right? Like I don't think we can only have one thing. But I do think that there is something to be said about just doing
Yeah.
Judaism, and it not having to be a vehicle for anything else, right? And that was to a great degree what our service was about. Um, the goal was to create a space that was going to be very reminiscent and comfortable for people who grew up in a Reform synagogue, right? Mostly folks of my generation are slightly younger. So the people that grew up with the kind of more Debbie Friedman Reform, slightly different than the Lewandowski Reform that I know are the ACJ board president Steve Naiman would have vastly preferred had he been there. I also love Lewandowski, but it was just very Hamish in that way, and it was in a traditional Reform synagogue. In fact, Union Temple, where we held it, is a 150 or something years old Reform temple, and the goal was to give these folks what they were missing. I've been hearing over and over and over again from people that they miss being able to go to synagogue because whether it's the flags on the bima, be they the American and Israeli or any flags, um, be it the sermons that they are not sure what they're going to be about, and whether they're going to have to sit through some kind of screed that's going to make them feel horrible, whether it's a prayer for the state of Israel or the recitation of Hatikvah or something. You just don't know what you're actually getting into when you go to a service at these synagogues anymore. And people want to know. They want to know that they can go and like be amongst people that they can feel comfortable with, that they're not going to have their Judaism questioned based on their lack of fealty to the state of Israel. And so that's what we did. And it was lovely. We also had 70 people, the magic number. The rabbis taught that there are 70 faces of Torah, so we had all 70 faces there. Um,
Lovely.
yeah. And it was really lovely. And some of the folks afterwards said that had we done like a bigger push advertising wise, we could have gotten many, many more. So we're still thinking about how we're going to continue with this. But do you think that your event will lead to future events similar or?
Yeah, it's a good question. We just had our debrief this morning at 8:30. So the five of us who planned this got together, and I mean, of course, all of us want to. I want to respond to what you said because I haven't read it thoroughly yet because I've been grading papers, but Jewish Currents just published something on
Yeah, the
Zionist
guy that wrote it is
realism.
on Zoom with us right now.
Is that right? Oh
Yes.
my goodness. Well, hello, author of this piece that I'm talking about. Um, so I haven't read it carefully yet, but a bunch of people sent it to me because thank you. You mentioned my book, which I really appreciate. Um, and I've heard, and we talked about this, I think, Andy, that
Mhm.
Shaul's, one of
Yes.
the things that Shaul talks about, Shaul Magid talks about is that, we're continuing to define ourselves around the pole of Israel and Zionism. If we are negating it or accepting it, then we're still, I don't know, you could use all kinds of verbs, filtering Judaism through that or orienting it around it. But I guess what's important to me right now, and especially important given the conversation we're having about students and visas and dissent and resistance, is that anti-Semitism, right, hatred of Jews is now being used as a pretext for all of this surveillance and these acts of these unconstitutional acts. And so I would say that it becomes important, I think, for us to put forward solidarity, whether that means positioning yourself as an anti-Zionist, and I know some people don't agree with that positioning. I know some people think you need to identify yourself for what you support and not what you reject. But as somebody who's taught, dozens of Palestinian students, I'm teaching two right now, and it becomes really important for me to locate myself outside of that, and also to say that my Judaism isn't I hate to use the word complicit, but I can't think of a better word, isn't tied to it, intertwined with it, with Palestinian oppression and a version of Zionism that allows for Palestinian oppression.
Yeah,
So you asked, sorry, your question was, are we doing more? We don't yet know. We have to figure out, there's a demand for it.
totally.
I'm supposed to be at two different Seders on Thursday. There are a lot of all these activist groups, there are a lot of young people and people like me, not so young, who are wanting this ritual and solidarity. So it'll be really interesting to see, and I can't wait to hear what our guest here has to say about how ritual is kind of playing out in forms of resistance.
Yeah,
When is your
awesome.
next one? You want to use this space to
I don't
advertise?
know yet. We're still figuring that out as well. We had a debrief. I think that this month we are not going to, or I know that this month we are not going to do another Shabbat service, but we may do something else, like maybe a Havdalah or something like that, and then try to do one next month, maybe. But not TBD. Part of our goal as well is well, let me put it this way. We don't currently have a goal of starting a like new Jewish community in Brooklyn, right? That takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. And if we start doing that every month, that almost becomes inevitable, right? And so we're trying to figure out what place this kind of programming has within the ACJ at this moment. Um, and so yeah, it's everything right now is kind of a journey, and we're trying to figure out exactly what niche to fill with the role that we have to play.
Well, can I just say they're very lucky to have you. So I'm
Oh,
sure it's
well,
going to be
thank you.
marvelous. And actually, now that I think about it, the Seders are all called Freedom Seders, which is modeled on the Seder that Rabbi Waskow and others had after
Mhm.
King's death, Dr. King's assassination. And so, this whole positioning of the struggle alongside civil rights, anti-racism, Palestinian solidarity, it's continuing. It's a through line. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and that's kind of to go back to you a little bit, John, uh, that's kind of the balance that is that I think the ACJ has always been trying to navigate, and that we're trying to navigate right now is like, what part of what we're doing is American? What part of
Mm.
what we're doing is Jewish? Like, how do those two things relate to each other? Where do they overlap? Where are they separate? And I think that is actually the um the underlying conflict going on with all of this, with because Israel and Zionism relates to both of those as well in its own way. And it's all of these different overlapping circles that are hard to disentangle on purpose. I think like I think they were this overlap was constructed to be hard to disentangle. um, but I want to stop talking because we have 10 minutes, and I want to make sure that if there are any questions from the folks on Zoom, there's space to ask them and answer them. I don't just want to hear questions, I want to hear your answers to them. Yeah, Bruce.
Okay, so thank you so much, Professor Feld, for that eloquent presentation. My question, just looking back at the Martin Blatt situation, do you have any idea what explains the vehemence with which people attacked these positions? That's just seems to be, I mean, there was a lot of anti-Zionism prior to World War II, and I understand that Shoah did some of that, um, working people out. But do you have any thoughts on why that vehemence against someone like Martin Blatt teaching a class in a university?
Well, I mean, I can just tell you plenty of things from my own childhood where Arafat was, I mean, actually seen, I say demonized, but he was actually seen as a demon. I mean, anti-Arab racism was just so prevalent, and it was fueled by this really earnest fear that Palestinian nationalism and Palestinian statehood was synonymous with Jewish destruction. So, it's 73 when he's teaching this class. And there's no question that Jewish communal leaders sort of, foment some of this animosity toward him, what you called as, vehement opposition. But I do think it's, I was talking to you beforehand, Andy, about, it's like, if you look at it's stationary from my youth, right? It's Jewish people, orthodontists and dentists and lawyers who are writing into Tufts and saying that Marty hates himself, his Jewishness. He has a pathology around his anti-Semitic views. And I mean, I've been labeled as such, not in the not too distant past. So I think that when Jewish safety and unquestioning loyalty to Zionism are held in a sacred part of people, of ourselves. I mean, they were when I was younger. My Holocaust education was very, very young, and it was very terrifying. Watching these videos of the Shoah when I was at a young age, and it was made very clear to me that this could happen to me if I didn't support Israel. So I guess that kind of schooling, those lessons live on inside of us. And I think that Holocaust trauma um, creates that kind of vehemence when people feel threatened. And I think that people really believed that his class could turn young American Jews and non-Jews toward, Palestinian advocacy, belief in Palestinian rights. And that, again, that was moving toward Jewish destruction. I can't explain it any better. Perhaps others on this call could, but that's how I would explain it. And that's how whenever I teach, especially not folks of this sophisticated level of understanding, but whenever I teach young folks, I start out by talking about at least 12 people. I can name at least 6 people I grew up with who had numbers on their arms in my conservative synagogue. And they were just so important to me, and their lessons, they would talk to my Hebrew school classes. And so the Holocaust was very alive for me. And I think in 1973, it was very alive for a lot of people, including Marty Blatt. He took that history, he took his own personal connection and translated it into working for more universalist causes, as Rabbi Andy was saying. But I think a lot of people turned that trauma into a much more vehement, self-oriented defense of Israel. I don't know. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Any other questions? John, yeah.
Dr. Feld, thank you so much for your work and for
Please just
coming
call
here
me
today.
Marjorie. Can everyone just
All
call
right,
me
Marjorie, you got
Yeah.
it. You got it. One of the things about your book that I love so much and why I used it in my piece is that you describe the Zionization process as a material one, rather than kind of like an ideological one, which is typically how it gets. It's a cause and effect type of thing, I guess. One of the things I'm really curious about is to like what extent did the institutions themselves kind of over determine like the aspect of Zionization? Like, these aren't democracies, right? Like if one did want to dissent and contest power, right? Like what were the capacities to contest that power to begin with, especially when we're talking about internal structures and then even, who has capital and then who doesn't. And one more question too. Sorry, the Kahana before he was in the JDL was actually a pro-Vietnam advocate, and so I'm wondering to what extent is like Zionization, especially in the 50s, is that happening coextensively with both the U.S. government and the Jewish community's persecution of the left-wing Jewish life and institutions? Like the IWO gets shut down by the government. This project seems to work in tandem with that, but it might just be coincidence. I don't know.
I don't think it's coincidence. I don't think it's entirely coincidence. And again, I try to teach students about these forces, and I say you never want to think about people sitting in a room, coming up with ideas to take control, right? It isn't 5 people. It's places where there isn't a lot of resistance when these things sweep in. And I think given the sacred place that trauma occupied in American Jewish people's lives, the way it was, again, married to unquestioning support for Israel. I mean, so I would say that Matt Berkman last week talked about the building of the apparatus, right, Andy, and how these American Jewish organizations present 67 as this like emotional response, but actually the emotional response happened also in 48. It's just that this apparatus was in place, and I think he said something like they identified Israel as something that would bring Jewish communities together, as something that worked, as something that's sold, if we want to be sort of transactional or more cynical about it. So your question is, I mean, I do think that the neoconservative movement, American Jews' embrace of Israel and these organizational embraces of Israel went hand in hand with American Jews, and I want to say this with great caution and gently, went hand in hand with the Jewish rise to powerful positions in American economic, cultural, political life. And so that positioning, pro-Israel positioning, became part of that integration of American Jews into positions of power. And, during the Cold War, it set us up pretty neatly into a white community that was finding its feet and controlling lots of capital. There were certainly lots of Jews who did not command a lot of economic power, many working class Jews. I do think that, I'm not sure I'm answering your question precisely, but I do think that it played well into reactionary movements against civil rights, affirmative action, labor rights. And as Jews are moving into more professions, I don't know, it all kinds of it kind of aligns pretty neatly. So when I end up quoting Baldwin, right, toward the end of the book, and he's looking at American Jews and really, really calling it a tragedy that, and I do think a lot of the people in the book in each chapter would think of it as a tragedy, thought of it as a tragedy in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and forward, that Jews had sort of lost this sense of what Rabbi Andy would call universalist ethics, had lost a sense of empathy with other groups. And I think that Baldwin calls it an exchange, like they made this exchange for power, and there was something profound lost in the bargain. So again, I say that really cautiously because I know that the topic of Jews and power is a difficult one to discuss. You asked also about the JDL and Kahane's journey, which Shaul Magid writes about really well in his book. And I'm trying to remember exactly what you asked me, but I do think that, some of the people who made this space that I was talking about earlier, this space where you can be against Vietnam and still offer your unqualified support to Israel, a lot of those people became and stayed and still are liberal Zionists. And many of us would think about this as an untenable position, but maintaining that position has allowed them to stay in non-dissenting circles and maintain a certain amount of credibility and power and capital that comes with those positions. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question. Well, maybe you need to restate it.
Do you want to restate it, John, or are you good? Okay, cool.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there is, I didn't actually read this article or this essay. Oh no, what's her name? She wrote it and got lambasted for it, and I don't even know why, called Shibboleth. Early on in uh, shortly after October 7th. Oh, I can't remember her name, and it's killing me. But uh, I do think that to a great degree that need to just say the thing to be part of the in group that you're talking about then gives you power is a big determinant of whether you're included in those halls of institutional power or not. And really, that is to me the one of the underlying um, threads of your entire book, right? Of like, what do you have to say and what can't you say in order to stay within the institutional world of American Judaism that will validate you as a Jew and will allow you access to all of the things that come along with that institutional those institutional resources. And yeah, hopefully, and I'm going to end here on a high note. Both you and I, in our experiences with Shabbat a couple weeks ago, show that there are alternatives arising, both within these institutions and outside of them. And I hope that, or I know that your work, your amazing work, is by shedding light on all of this, is helping that to happen. And so I want to thank you for continuing to do this work, even when it's incredibly hard and you're seeing so much horror happen around you with regard to the crackdown on people, on students, on all of that. And in spite of it, you persevere. So thank you, Marjorie, for being with us. Thank you for doing the work you do. And thank all of you for being here this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Andy. And thank you for the thoughtful questions. I'm easily to find, so I'm happy to talk offline too with folks.
Yeah.
I appreciate everyone being here and the folks on YouTube.
Great, thank you.
Thank you,
And
Rabbi
we're
Andy.
coming back next month, like I said, with Dr. Atalia Omer from University of Notre Dame. All right, have a great night, everyone. Chag Sameach, happy Passover.
Sweet Passover to all.
Bye.